2 years ago, I was walking through the neighborhood. Same thing I do every Sunday. Looking at what people grow. Roses, lavender, the odd tomato vine escaping through a fence. Then one house stopped me cold, against the side wall, behind a low hedge, a plant I didn't recognize. And next to it, a locked metal cage. Warning sign on the front. The plant was growing inside the cage. I stood there, told myself it was nothing. Someone's art project. I kept walking. I never knocked, never looked it up. Weeks went by, months. Then one afternoon I walked past again. The plant had doubled in size, still caged, sign still there. That was when I knocked. I finally knocked on the door. I expected some shy, eccentric hobby explanation. Instead, my neighbor, a microbiologist, it turned out, told me the name of the plant calmly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Dendrocnide moroides. I had never heard it. That night, I looked it up. I wish I had started sooner. I also wish I had never started at all. Because once I understood what was growing behind, that hedge, I could not stop thinking about it. The entire plant, every leaf, every stem, is coated in hollow silicon-based hairs called trichomes. They look like fine fur, like something you'd want to touch. That is exactly the trap. The moment you do, the tips fracture, break off at the point of contact, and then they inject a cocktail of neurotoxins directly under the skin, stable, resilient, absolutely furious. Everyone who's been stung describes it differently, but they all reach for the same three images: being set on fire, being doused in acid, being electrocuted, all at the same time. That is not a metaphor. That is the most controlled language survivors can find. The burning starts immediately, and then, and this is the part that shook me most, it gets worse. Intensifies over the next 20 to 30 minutes, and then it does not stop. Weeks. Sometimes months. The hairs lodge beneath the skin as it heals over them. Touch triggers them. Pressure triggers them. Cold triggers them. People describe that as icy lightning bolts through the skin. In 1866, a surveyor's horse was stung by this plant. It reportedly went mad, dead within 2 hours. A woman named Naomi Lewis was hospitalized for a week after falling into one. 9 months later, still experiencing pain flare-ups. She had 4 children, one a natural delivery. She said on record that none of them came close to what that plant had done to her leg. I stood up from my desk, walked to the window, looked toward my neighbor's garden. Somewhere behind the hedge, behind the cage, behind the warning sign, that plant was just sitting there, looking like something you'd walk past without a thought. That was the moment I understood why the cage existed. Not because it was rare, not because it was hard to grow, because it is one of those things in nature that asks almost nothing of you and takes everything in return. Outside Australia, almost nobody knows this plant exists. In Queensland, it is not obscure. Hikers know it, farmers know it. Forestry workers are briefed on it before entering certain areas. Warning signs line the trails where it grows. In Australia, not knowing this plant is considered a serious lapse in preparation. The rest of the world, nothing. No awareness, no recognition. You could stand directly in front of one, in a neighbor's garden, for instance, and have no idea what you were looking at. That makes no sense. This is not some newly cataloged species from a remote expedition. Dendrocnide moroides was formally described in 1857. The name comes from ancient Greek, dendron, tree, nidos, stinging needle. The name tells you everything, and still, almost nobody outside the southern hemisphere has heard of it. The people who work with dangerous plants professionally keep this one behind glass. The Alnwick Garden in Northumberland houses its specimen inside a locked case in their poison garden. It sits alongside cannabis, ricin, and henbane. These are not casual plant companions. The Gympie Gympie is still the one in the locked case. The people who handle dangerous plants for a living looked at everything available and locked this one away separately. The plant in my neighbor's garden was not behind institutional glass, not in a collection with staff and protocols. It was on a residential street, in a cage, yes, with a sign, yes, but on an ordinary street where people walk past daily with dogs and groceries and children. That points to something larger than one unusual gardener. There is a subculture of collectors who seek out dangerous flora, not to cause harm, but because rarity is its own kind of gravity. The more impossible a plant seems, the more compelled people are to grow it. The more dangerous, the more it represents the outer limit of what a private garden can contain. Dendrocnide moroides sits exactly at that limit. It offers something almost no other plant can: a complete rearrangement of how you think about what an ordinary looking leaf is capable of doing to you, and almost no one walking past it would ever know. The science makes this considerably stranger than the pain alone. Dendrocnide moroides belongs to the Articaceae family, the nettles. If you've ever brushed a stinging nettle, you have a reference point, a very loose one. The Gympie gympie and the common nettle are related roughly the way a house cat and a tiger are. Same family. Entirely different order of magnitude. Native to tropical rainforests of northeastern Australia and Malaysia, growing from sea level to around 200 meters, large, shrubby, up to 4 meters tall, broad heart-shaped leaves, a surface that looks from a distance almost soft, velvety, approachable. That is not an accident. Every leaf, every stem, every piece of fruit is coated in trichomes, hollow, silicon-based hairs, nearly invisible to the naked eye, hypodermic needles, in biological terms. The moment skin makes contact, the tips don't bend, don't compress. They fracture and inject directly beneath the skin. You already know what that feels like. Here is what most people don't know. Most assume it works like a nettle, a histamine response, something the body clears within hours. That assumption is completely wrong. The neurotoxins inside those trichomes are chemically stable, not temporarily stable, stable across decades. Dried herbarium specimens, kept in collections for over a century, have stung botanists who handled them without protection. The toxin doesn't degrade, doesn't lose potency sitting in a residential cage. It simply waits. In 2020, University of Queensland researchers identified and named the toxins, gympiotides, miniproteins, structurally similar to the neurotoxic peptides found in spider venom and cone snail venom. That is not a comparison made for dramatic effect. It means a flowering plant evolved entirely independently, a pain delivery mechanism operating along the same biological pathways as the most sophisticated animal venoms on Earth. That is what convergent evolution looks like when it arrives somewhere no one expected. Because the needles lodge beneath the skin as it heals over them, the toxins aren't delivered once. They are reactivated every time something disturbs the embedded hairs. Pressure, touch, cold water, a temperature shift. The plant does not sting you and move on. It installs itself. That is the entire design. The science makes this considerably stranger than the pain alone. Dendrocnide moroides belongs to the Urticaceae family, the nettles. If you've ever brushed a stinging nettle, you have a reference point, a very loose one. The Gympie gympie and the common nettle are related roughly the way a house cat and a tiger are. Same family, entirely different order of magnitude. Native to tropical rainforests of northeastern Australia and Malaysia, growing from sea level to around 200 meters. Large, shrubby, up to 4 meters tall, broad, heart-shaped leaves, a surface that looks from a distance almost soft, velvety, approachable. That is not an accident. Every leaf, every stem, every piece of fruit is coated in trichomes, hollow, silicon-based hairs, nearly invisible to the naked eye. Hypodermic needles in biological terms. The moment skin marks connect, the tips don't bend, don't compress. They fracture and inject directly beneath the skin. You already know what that feels like. Here is what most people don't know. Most assume it works like a nettle, a histamine response, something the body clears within hours. That assumption is completely wrong. The neurotoxins inside those trichomes are chemically stable, not temporarily stable, stable across decades. Dried herbarium specimens, kept in collections for over a century, have stung botanists who handled them without protection. The toxin doesn't degrade, doesn't lose potency sitting in a residential cage. It simply waits. In 2020, University of Queensland researchers identified and named the toxins gympiotides, miniproteins structurally similar to the neurotoxic peptides found in spider venom and cone snail venom. That is not a comparison made for dramatic effect. It means a flowering plant evolved entirely independently, a pain delivery mechanism operating along the same biological pathways as the most sophisticated animal venoms on Earth. That is what convergent evolution looks like when it arrives somewhere no one expected. Because the needles lodge beneath the skin as it heals over them, the toxins aren't delivered once. They are reactivated every time something disturbs the embedded hairs. Pressure, touch, cold water, a temperature shift. The plant does not sting you and move on. It installs itself. That is the entire design. I've documented a lot of unusual plants for this channel. What my neighbor described is unlike any of them. He'd grown bananas in his front garden years before, which gave him a working sense of what tropical species need in a temperate climate. The Gympie Gimpy, he said, is not difficult to keep alive, not fussy about soil. It doesn't demand constant intervention. Given warmth and moisture, it simply grows, which is, depending on your perspective, either impressive or deeply unsettling. In a different context, you might call it handsome, architecturally striking, up to 4 meters, heart-shaped leaves, something you'd put in a conservatory and not think twice about. The containment is where the real discipline lives. He built the cage before the plant reached any significant size. The warning sign went on before he brought it indoors, not a decorative label, a warning. Because protective equipment is not optional, and it extends well beyond a standard pair of gardening gloves. Thick gloves are only the beginning. The trichomes become airborne when the plant is disturbed. Respiratory protection, a proper mask, not a cloth layer, is essential during any maintenance. Full arm coverage, eye protection. Even then, the protocol is to interact with the plant as rarely as possible. The margin for error is 0. I asked what happened before the cage was fully secured. He paused. Then he said he caught the back of his wrist against a lower leaf while positioning the frame, not full contact, a glancing touch, a second. He described the sensation as arriving slowly, and then all at once. Like something he had no existing language for. He managed it. But he said the experience clarified, with great efficiency, why the cage could not wait another day. There is no gradual introduction to this plant, no threshold sting that serves as a warning. It doesn't calibrate to your level of preparedness. It simply demonstrates immediately what it has always been capable of. That, I think, is the most honest cultivation guide I can offer. 6 months later, he invited me to observe an inspection. During active growth, which can happen multiple times a year in controlled conditions, the Gympie Gimpy produces fruit, small, clustered, dark red. Seen through the cage bars, they look almost exactly like blackberries. The resemblance is not accidental. Moroides comes from Morus, the mulberry genus. The plant was named in part for how innocent its fruit looks. It is not reassuring information, because the fruit carries trichomes, not in the same density as the leaves. But enough, everything this plant produces, leaves, stems, fruit, any shed material, is part of the same delivery system. None of it is inert. There is no part of this plant that permits casual handling. You don't approach it differently depending on which section you're near, all of it. Same way, every time, full protective gear before the cage is unlocked. He checks the structure first, then the soil surface for fallen material, then the plant's proximity to the bars. As it grows, it eventually presses against the frame, and that becomes a transfer risk for anyone touching the outside without realizing. And then he checks for seeds. The seeds are viable. They can germinate in surrounding soil if not managed. Left to its own tendencies, the plant does what all plants do, reproduce and spread. Reasonable from the plant's perspective. Completely incompatible with keeping one on a residential street. Here is the mistake. During an early inspection, he removed fallen dried material from inside the cage. Leaves that had browned and dropped naturally. He was wearing gloves. He assumed dried material had reduced potency, that trichomes in a desiccated leaf were somehow spent. Degraded, they were not. He felt the sting through the glove within seconds. Not a full episode. The gloves helped. The exposure was brief, a sharp, clarifying reminder. The lesson arrived immediately and has not required repeating. The toxins do not degrade with drying. Herbarium specimens kept for over a century have stung botanists who handled them carelessly. Dried does not mean safe. Dried means the same plant, different form, identical capability, no visible warning. He now uses a dedicated long-handled tool, never hands, even heavily gloved, to remove any shed material, everything into sealed disposal. No assumptions, no shortcuts. The plant does not make exceptions for the material it has already shed. It was always going to behave exactly this way. The only mistake was imagining otherwise. You can't eat it, can't touch it, can't stand near it without full protective equipment. So what is it actually for? Dendrochnide moroides was never unknown to the people who lived alongside it. Aboriginal Australians in Queensland understood this plant for thousands of years before any European botanist catalogued it. Specific knowledge, practical, generational. The kind that comes from living within a landscape, not passing through it. Certain accounts describe its use in ceremonial endurance contexts. Others reference controlled application of the leaves for rheumatic pain, using the sting itself in managed doses as a counter-irritant, a painful remedy for a painful condition, less unusual than it sounds. Nettles have been used across European folk medicine the same way. Deliberate stinging of arthritic joints to provoke inflammation and stimulate circulation. Same principle. Entirely different scale. The 2020 University of Queensland study on gympiotides didn't stop at identification. The researchers found these mini-proteins activate pain receptors through pathways that resist standard treatment. Antihistamines don't address them. Common analgesics barely reduce them. Not a gap in medicine, a signal from the plant. If you can map a pain pathway that current pharmaceuticals can't reach, you found something worth studying carefully. The plant that produces the most sustained pain experience documented in botany is being studied for what it might reveal about pain relief. The world's most efficient pain delivery system, examined for what it might teach us about ending pain. That inversion is what this plant is for. Beyond the lab, its use is educational. The Alnwick Garden maintains a specimen for exactly this reason, not as spectacle, as botanical literacy. People who understand what plants are capable of are better equipped than people who assume all greenery is passive. There is one problem. Studying gympiotides requires obtaining them. Obtaining them means handling this plant, and this plant causes serious injury if anything goes wrong. The most scientifically valuable compound it produces is also the most dangerous to extract. Everything it might one day offer medicine sits behind a barrier of genuine physical risk. The plant does not make itself easy to use. That appears to be a consistent feature, not an exception. What it offers in the end is a confrontation with how little most of us know about what grows around us and what that ignorance actually costs. This plant has caused documented harm since 1857. It has hospitalized people. Professional botanists keep it in locked glass. So why does almost nobody outside Australia know what it looks like? None of the answers are particularly reassuring. The first is how plant knowledge travels. Agricultural knowledge spreads because commerce drives it. When a crop has value, seed companies, farming networks, and supply chains carry information across continents within a generation. Economic value is an extraordinarily efficient vehicle. Dangerous plant knowledge doesn't have that vehicle. It travels through education, field guides, botanical institutions, forestry training, school curricula, slower systems, less funded, without the momentum commerce generates. Nobody profits from teaching people to recognize the gympie. The knowledge stays where the plant originated, in Queensland, among the people who have direct reason to need it. The second reason is quieter. We've come to treat plants as passive. Thorns are visible. Poisonous berries tend to be distinctive. Dangerous fungi require deliberate ingestion. Not entirely wrong for most situations. Catastrophically wrong for this one. A plant that looks soft produces fruit resembling blackberries and hospitalizes you through a glancing touch doesn't fit any standard mental model of plant danger. When something doesn't fit the model, the easiest response is to assume the warnings are exaggerated. They are not exaggerated. The assumption of plant passivity persists because, for most of botanical history, in most gardens, it has been largely accurate. The third reason is the one that actually concerns me. The subculture of collectors seeking dangerous flora is growing. The internet has made locating, purchasing, and importing unusual specimens easier than ever. A private individual in an English city can acquire a live gympie. A neighbor, a postal worker, a child cutting through the garden. None of them have any framework for recognizing what they're near. Botanical literacy has declined across most urban populations over several generations. The people most likely to know what a dangerous plant looks like are not the people most likely to encounter one. That is the gap. Not a conspiracy, not negligence. Just two trends moving in opposite directions, rare plants becoming more accessible, the knowledge to identify them becoming less common, arriving at the same address. The cage in my neighbor's garden is a responsible solution to an individual problem. It is not a solution to the larger one. I started this by walking past a cage in a neighbor's garden. I ended it understanding that the cage was not the unusual part. The unusual part was that I had gone however many years without knowing such a plant existed, without the vocabulary to look at something that dangerous and name it. That gap is not specific to me or to this plant. There are things growing in gardens near you right now that most people cannot identify. Some completely harmless, some not. The difference is not always visible on the pavement. One practical thing. Learn through someone else's experience, not mine. Take warning signs seriously, not as decoration, not as eccentricity. A warning sign on a plant is information, possibly the most useful you'll encounter in a residential setting. My first instinct is to assume it was nothing. That instinct was wrong. I carried it for months. Had I walked into that garden and touched the plant, the sign would have told me exactly what I was dealing with. If I had been willing to believe, it believed the signs. My neighbor did not keep his knowledge private. Every person who stopped at his fence left that conversation knowing what Dendrocnide moroides was, how to identify it, why the cage existed, why the sign was not an exaggeration. He gave away awareness the way some gardeners give away seeds, freely, deliberately, person to person, because it costs nothing to pass on and carries genuine value on the other side. That is the best possible use of a plant you cannot eat, cannot touch, and cannot share as a cutting. If you find value in understanding what actually grows in the world around us, the overlooked, the dangerous, the misunderstood, and the genuinely extraordinary, subscribe to Rootwise HQ. There is more here than most of us were ever taught to look for. The cage in the garden was not a warning about one plant. It was a warning about the gap between what exists and what we know. We are, all of us, only just beginning to look.